Can you hear that? Sounds of the beach in Nipaluna. Less than a 10-minute walk from my house lies paradise. I see glistening water, huge rocks and boulders that look like they were loaned from Mars, the most magical cloud formations, the most ancient trees. And I love when you can see flowers growing off the sides of rocks and cliffs and mountains. So sexy. And this is why I insist that I do not need a studio and heaps of production to do this podcast. So long as I have a phone, a microphone, Sarah and V editing, amazing. So then I can do this, have a chat by the water. I hope this episode of No Deep Dives feels a bit like a meditation, in the sense that when the nuggets of wisdom I'm dropping become too much to hold, just zone me out and listen to the waves crashing along the shore. That feels like the sexiest thing to do. And if you're currently watching this and you feel the camera shake, just know it's the wind. Know that you are outside in the elements. No need to confuse yourself. You're just outside. This is No Deep Dives, a Flex Mommy podcast. This episode is about time, our relationship to time from a Western and First Nations concept, about how being a child of an immigrant who's also born in a country that they're not from also in some ways feels a lot like Baudrillard's concept of simulacra. Naturally, astrology is dribbled into there, and yeah, enjoy. Miss you, bye. About 18 months ago when I moved to Melbourne, one of the first conversations I remember having with someone I didn't know was on a night out at this bar called Runner's Bar, Runner-Up Bar. I don't know, it's near Hope Street. And I'm pretty sure my friends and I went there because Hope Street had closed and we were still talking. We end up sitting in a booth and we run into some people who recognized me from Instagram. And I remember one of the first questions that they asked me was, what's my AFL team? And that's when I realized I was really in a different place, because they're not asking questions like that in Sydney at all. Oh, it's because they were going to an AFL game afterwards, I remember. But one of the guys there kept emphasizing simulacra. And it's a term coined by Jean Baudrillard. And it refers to representations or imitations of people or things. So simulacra are seen as copies that depict entities without an original reference or that no longer have an original. So it's a philosophical concept that explores how representations or imitations of things shape our perception of reality. And so the key elements of it is that there's got to be this representation versus reality thing happening. So a simulacrum is a representation of something. It could be an image, an object, or an idea that stands in for a real thing. For example, a painting of a tree represents a real tree. However, in simulacra, the representation may no longer resemble or relate to the original image at all. A simulacrum can exist without any connection to an original. It's a copy of something that doesn't truly exist. For example, Disneyland, which represents an idealized version of American culture, but it doesn't reflect a real place. It creates its own version of reality. Then Baudrillard expands on the concept by arguing that in our modern media-saturated world, we increasingly live in a hyperreality, a state where simulacra replaces and becomes more real to us than reality itself. So this is like social media curation, where we can see these snapshots of people doing things that give us an indication of what could happen in real life for us, but it is a hyper curation of that experience, and it becomes so real to us that we identify with this simulated version of reality as opposed to what the original experience would be like. So hyperreality is when the boundary between reality and the simulation breaks down, and we start to treat the simulation as if it's the real thing. So it could be like when you see an ad for a really amazing burger or something, and you know you've never seen the burger look that good, but that's what your projecting in your mind's eye when you are craving said burger or experience. And so there's also this idea that simulacra can challenge the idea of authenticity or originality, because when everything is mediated by images or symbols, what is real becomes harder to define. So the stages of simulacra start at the faithful copy, where the representation looks like and refers to the original. So taking a photo of like a city in its natural state. Then you have the perversion of reality, where the representation distorts the original but still refers to it. So you can see this in a lot of travel content where you're like, okay, I've been to that place before and it looks like that if nobody, it's like when I went to the Taj Mahal and I was so confused by how many people there were. And it occurred to me in that moment that I'd never really seen a photo of the Taj Mahal that wasn't edited to take the people out of it or to document it at a random time of day, like 5 a.m. when nobody's there, catching this rare glimpse of sunrise that you probably wouldn't see in your lifetime, but that's the image that you are attached to. Then there's the pretense of the copy, where the representation pretends to refer to reality but doesn't correspond to any real thing. And I guess we can see this a lot in a lot of the fantasies that we have around the world due to like Hollywood and media, where everybody is convinced that their approach to friendship is flawed because they don't live in an apartment building with all of their friends and pay peanuts to live in the middle of New York City, right? It's like almost there but not quite. And then there's pure simulation, where the representation exists independently with no connection to reality. So it becomes its own reality, which is, I don't know, like cryptocurrency maybe, where it's like, it's not really like anything we've seen before, but it exists in our reality. So I guess it's real. And so when you look around, you can see versions of this, right? Like social media is a good example of a simulacrum where you're like, oh, okay, this can't be fully real, but it's happening, so it must be real. And then also it causes you to reflect on your own understanding of what you think real is, because what you're looking at is a projection of what could happen, but definitely doesn't happen. Also, you can see it reflected just in culture generally, where stereotypes are now replacing the lived experience. And it reminds me of a conversation or a DM that I heard from my friend Anna, who I'm pretty sure she sent it to me after seeing the video that I made on Patreon analysing Australia's birth chart. The more that I learn astrology, the more that I understand the use case in a practical sense. And if something is going to exist in the universe, in nature, it's going to be part of a cycle. That cycle is creation, maintenance, destruction. And if it exists on that cycle, then you can cast a birth chart for it. People, places, businesses. I know that Chani Nicholas was able to time her wedding vows around a specific planetary alignment. So yeah, pre-casting a birth chart for an experience you want to have. So the more I travel and the more that I am able to experience cultures for what they are first person, I can zoom out of what Australia has been like for me. And I'm like, okay, something's off here. Something really isn't quite right. But, 11:11. Anna was referring to a video that she saw that said that Australia has no culture and all the immigrants are lost and confused. And you can find the full analysis in the link in the show notes, but going through that exercise was a form of catharsis, because I was like, wait a second. It affirmed what I was already experiencing in a way that plenty of people have also been experiencing, but perhaps the words they would use or the phrases they would use have been demeaned. So, for example, for years and years and years and years, people have been referring to tall poppy syndrome in Australia, where Australians have the tendency to want to belittle or ground people who they perceive to be too egocentric, right? The irony is that in the process of trying to humble someone, you are prioritizing your ego over theirs. And a lot of people have these conflicting thoughts about how tall poppy syndrome works because, like Australia doesn't automatically hate or have disdain for people who have amassed some sort of a success, right? Because look at Margot Robbie or look at Hugh Jackman or look at Nicole Kidman. And it's like, no, you'll notice that there is a particular maybe phase or cycle where if these people are on land in Australia, then perhaps they're not going to be revered and claimed. But as soon as they go to a country like America or the UK, where other people can vouch for this person's esteem or their success or their star power, then suddenly Australians are on board. And what that affirms to me is that the way that Australia views success is that you're allowed to have yours if I can get mine. But if I don't get mine, then you can't have yours. And if you think about proximity to culture, a lot of Australians believe that in some way they can benefit from other cultures perceiving them highly through the conduit of a famous celebrity. Caveat being that this famous celebrity must look, smell, hold themselves, appear as a down-to-earth Australian, even if that's not their experience, just to pander to other Australians. And then I thought to myself, wow, maybe the experience of immigrants in Australia is kind of like a simulacra in itself, because what we're doing is role-playing culture of some sort, but not in a way that any of us recognize as being the way that you interact with other people. And there have been heaps of debates online about the confusion of how community is done in Australia versus other countries. And, we'll say things like, even recently, I think a couple of months ago, there was this big debate on Australian TikTok about how Australians don't want to bring gifts at weddings or pay an exorbitant amount in a gift to cover them for attending the wedding. And there's this cross-cultural confusion happening and maybe like a cross-cultural lost in translation moment. And so if you think about it, right, I was born in Australia. My mum's been in Australia for like 40 years, give or take. And the cultural double speak that we've had to do was all I've ever known. So having to reconcile these two contrasting truths that while you're from here, nobody really thinks that you're from here. You don't really understand how you're really from here. But when you go where you're from, you're also not from there. And then you have to think, okay, well, by the book, I am everything that others would deem me to be and have to be a citizen of this environment, and yet it's not enough. So then I'm thinking, okay, if we're going to use the stages of simulacra to provide a mirror of some sort to my experience in Australia or any kind of technical immigrant's experience in Australia, then we think about, okay, well, what is the faithful copy of that? That would mean that I would be born here and not be forced to assimilate in any way for fear of being a social leper or a pariah or being a stain on Australian culture. So how can I prove that I am just like the many? So the faithful copy is that, yes, in my household, I did and was allowed to maintain and celebrate my Ghanaian culture and heritage through the food we ate or, the clothes we wore, the language we spoke, or even the values that I was raised with. Until I spent a lot of time in Ghana as an adult, I just thought they were an extension of my own family as opposed to being cornerstones of culture that even after 40 years of establishing home on this land, still couldn't shake. Crazy. So I guess if every kind of immigrant or child born of an immigrant in Australia were experiencing a faithful copy of their experience, then they would feel a really strong tie to their quote-unquote original culture, and they would also see themselves as a part of their original culture, the traditions, the lineage. There wouldn't be this dissonance or this doublespeak or this duality that would constantly make them feel as though they had to pick between one or the other, and it would be respected by those who interacted with them that they would be of another culture, but also of this culture. Recognizing that the two can and do coexist with clarity in many places, and so it would be realistic for that to also happen here. So the next stage would be the perversion of reality, where the representation distorts the original image but still refers to it. So then what would happen is that your perception, your African perception, cultural perception, wherever you come from, would be shaped by external perceptions in Australia. So you wouldn't be having a first-person experience saying, well, in my culture, where I'm from, it's very normal to eat food like this or to look a certain way or to have different beauty standards or social norms. You would now say that insight is defunct or outdated because in this predominant culture, it is asking you to either align yourself closely to the stereotypes of the culture you come from, or the assumptions about what it means to be from that culture that you come from, or to conform to the culture that you're in. I think this would also dovetail into a hyper-romanticized version of where you come from, or people feeling so exotic, or, you know, you wear a lot of colors and like, this is so interesting. Thank you for bringing that culture here to us. Or, you know, assuming that you have a tolerance for spice that they wouldn't have or something. It just would feel like this distortion or this conscious awareness that as you gravitate towards one version of your culture, you are alienating yourself in the culture that you reside in, and doing this push and pull, or this accept or not accept, or appreciate it as a tourist. I think that a lot of children of immigrants in Australia have been socialised to view their culture as something that they can participate in like a tourist, or like a VIP tourist. And similarly, what I do notice is that, like, I remember having a conversation with this guy once, and like, this is like a white guy. I read some of his writing, and as he's describing the experience that he had while in America, and he was recounting some dialogue he overheard, this man writes the N-word. So naturally, I'm thinking, if we're friends, then let me tell you that this is strange. So I pass on the feedback. I say, hey, King, I was loving the writing up until this point. I don't really know why you had to write that. I don't really know why you had to say it like that. I don't really know why this is the story you wanted to tell. But either way, just like, you know, FYI. And his kind of feedback or criticism for me was that me feeling hypersensitive over the N-word is misplaced, because if we're both born in Australia, then we are equidistant from that culture, and neither of us should be policing it. And that's when I thought to myself, in what world have I ever been viewed by anyone as being more aligned to Australian culture than American? Like, I spent my whole life with people calling me African American because Black or African was seen as a slur or distasteful. And now in the year of 2023, I have an Australian guy telling me that I can't feel some kind of way about him writing the N-word because we're both Australian. And I said, this might feel like a perversion of reality. Because my African identity is becoming filtered through an Australian societal lens, which is then forcing me to distort the relationship I have towards Blackness, Africanness, and like being part of a non-dominant culture. And then being like, damn, thank you for that insight. Now I must reflect. Okay, so then the next stage would be the pretense of the copy, where the representation pretends to be real but has no original. And so I guess if you are, like we've been saying, a child of an immigrant in a place where you were born, your identity becomes this hybrid, but not a choose your own adventure hybrid, where it's like, okay, maybe I'm 10% of this culture and 90% of this culture in this context, but in this context, I'm this percentage and this percentage. It feels like you try but fail in some ways to blend your culture with Australian cultural norms, and then have to reckon with the fact that when people say Australia has no culture, it's reflecting the confusion with understanding what does the environment actually want from you, what would give people the impression and the assurance and the certainty that yes, you are Australian. Because it's definitely not the accent, and it's not being born here, and it's not eating Vegemite, and it's not being socialised in Australian environments, and it's not having your nationality be Australian. And so then what you do is start to create, again, this pretense of your experience. So your culture, or in my case, the Africanness that I'm experiencing, becomes a reflection of media depictions, secondhand narratives, or reconstructed traditions, or a fourth secret thing, which is just using Black people from media as the end-all and be-all, and taking my behaviour and measuring it against the closest reflection of Blackness possible. So then you end up performing a hybrid version of your Australianness and your culture in a way that is sensationalized, but also heavily influenced by the way that it's observed. So when I think about African culture, right, I think about the way that Afrobeats has really popped off and it's given room. When I say it's given room, I think of like water having free reign to roll down a stream, right? Like it's people are letting this influence be seen and letting the source of the influence be known by saying, oh, okay, this music is really good and it came from Africa. It's not an extension of American music. It's just African music. And so then I see this like over-identification with Afrobeats as a central part of African culture because of the way that the world is responding to it so positively. And granted, let's say when you go to Ghana, they're not calling it Afrobeats, okay? They're going to call it hip life, high life, or just music. But knowing the verbiage that your environment will relate to is going to affect how you then communicate your version of you. I mean, let's use African culture for an example. People often talk about how there's a lot of African people in Melbourne who will use an American accent. Now, there's this criticism about why have these people pushed away their original culture in favor of a culture that they have no ties to. And it's like, you're asking why, or you're asking how, or you're asking what? Because not understanding why it's happened is part of the issue in itself. You don't see the way that you also, as the observer, as the spectator, have confused both cultures and created almost like homogeneity about it. And now you're confused as to why the people who were on the receiving end of your confusion are also confused about who they are and what they believe in and what is part of their culture to hold on to. And when I think a lot about this constructed identity, I think about how when people from non-Australian cultures in Australia choose to hold on to that culture, it's seen as not just a neutral decision, but it's violent in its approach. It is done in spite of Australians. And you can see a lot of conservative talking points allude to that. You know, why would they come here into this land of wealth and bounty and not participate? They're going to take our resources, blah, 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 blah. And to that I say, takes one to know one. And then the last stage of the simulacra is pure simulation, where in this instance, the person I'm referring to, myself or otherwise, will experience an entirely new identity, which is neither African or Australian. It's somewhere in between. And this somewhere in between for so many millions of people in one place is like this purgatory, limbo, labyrinth, no man's land. But the thing that gets me is for the last decade, a little bit longer, I've spent my life and my time in different forms trying to construct my identity in a way that would improve my experience on this land, in this world. And as I'm trying to construct an identity, it was becoming really clear to me that you don't need to construct one, you have one. You are one. And I realized it was this like process of simulacra that had confused me into thinking that because the people that I'm interacting with couldn't place my experience, then that experience did not exist. And so starting from a point where in some ways I was internalizing the idea that I didn't exist because there was no frame of reference for what I was experiencing, that means my foundation of not existing was just transmuting and transmuting and transmuting to a point where I was like, I can just be whoever and do whatever and say whatever, which is true. But it was pointing to a much larger experience that many could relate to, plenty do relate to, and that's why I'm making this episode right now. Because when I was analysing Australia's birth chart, I was like, this is what this fucking is. Australia has so many earth sign placements, which makes them over-identify with what can be seen and known, which also means that people shape their own experience by what others can validate. You can validate my class, my social status, my belief systems by where I live and what I dress like and what suburb I was born in. And that works, I guess, when you've created your identity to be a reflection of what you hope you are, as opposed to what exists around you. My friend Will showed me this video. I'll also put it in the show notes, but it's essentially talking about how First Nations people of Australia approach time and how it's so contrasting to how the West approaches time. And it dawned on me that, wait a second. Like, I really feel like a lot of people are under the impression that anything from 3,000 years ago and beyond was Neanderthal times, not recognizing that people just like us with our thoughts and neuroses and dreams and hopes and wishes were living on this land for 50,000 years. 50,000 years. And then, bam, colonization decides to wipe out a whole population, full genocide, in like less than 300 years. And then so you have to wonder, it's not that Australia doesn't have a culture. It means the people who were building Australia in a new image were doing it in contrast to whatever had been here before. And if whatever had been here before was rich culture, a really informed relationship to the land and everything on it, an appreciation for the stories that provide context for who we are and why we're here, then you can definitely see why Australia feels like this. Like, I'm looking at it right now and it feels like a dreamscape. This place is so beautiful, so calm, so serene, yet everything is built on top of essentially graves and corpses. Like, we're sitting here comfortable and relaxed with no real awareness of the violence that all of this land experienced mere seconds ago. And the other thing that Australia really struggles with, and when I say Australia, I mean colonial Australia, white Australia, is that because it's so materially minded, it does not favour or respect the immaterial, the spiritual, everything that is in between the object. And that is why Australians can't really see that something is off here. Because when you can't see the spiritual, when you can't look at the rock and see the spiritual implications, when you can't look at the water and see the spiritual implications, then why would you extend that same grace to a person? Yikes, 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 yikes. However, this video is so sick because, as we know, the way the West perceives time is linear. It's always moving forward. It's always moving towards a culmination point of some sorts. And it gives us the impression that it had to have started somewhere. Like, there was a point in time where someone said, okay, this is day one of the world, and we've been going forward ever since. Which can also explain why so many Western cultures have this ingrained fear of death, this ingrained fear of aging, and this ingrained fear of progression, because these all become markers of time that people think they don't have enough of. And when you don't think you have enough time, what do? You overcompensate with the material. You say, I need to make sure the way that my time spent is reflected in a way that I can see it. Give me that house. I fell for it too, everyone. I fell for it too. One might say, buying so deeply into the system, the material system, is what's given me the perspective to be like, wrong. And when I reflect on me coming to this point of view, I think a lot of people would criticize it and say, well, maybe you only feel this way because you didn't get the type of success you wanted. I got it twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 times. Thank you. Check the CV. And even then, I'm like, this shit is still not right. I can say it from a place of privilege. I can say it from a place of oppression. Whatever place you want me to say it from, I feel it deeply and I know it to be true. And whether or not you feel it deeply and know it to be true, that's your ministry. But for me, where I'm sitting, I'm like, oh... I said before, it takes one to know one. That is a idiom, that's a phrase, a cliche that I learned in primary school in Australia. And it's very apt, it's very profound. It takes one to know one. You can only recognize what you know, really. You recognize it for what it is because in some ways you resonate with it or you've been socialized to see it in that way. And the reason why I can understand like this material over everything is because I compared the astrology of my birth chart to the astrology of Australia. And I said, oh, You know, I can see the ways we're very similar, but I can also see the ways that we don't work together. You see, in everybody's birth chart, there is a point that expresses to you where your kind of hero's journey is. What's this big quest that you're meant to do in this lifetime, right? And there are two polarities to that quest. There's your comfort zone, and then there's a zone of challenge. And ideally, you get out of the comfort zone to go to your zone of challenge and get shit shaking. Well, my comfort zone is a direct match for Australia's ideal perceived image. Good job, you got the money, you got the car, you got the big friend group, whatever it might be. This is why when I come to Australia, I'm like stuck in this whirlpool loophole of being like, what else is there to do? You know what really got me? After my 10th great achievement in a row, having plenty of people who have not done what I've done in the way that I've done it, or have the skills to do it, asking me what I'm going to do next. Don't piss me off. Don't ask me during the mere moments after I've written a book, well, what are you doing next? I just wrote a book, got it published, best-selling author. Don't chat to me about what's next. Because that is the nature of this like cycle that Australia likes to perceive itself on. The workhorse, doing, reaping, don't get off the horse. Are you weak? I thought you were a hard worker. Get back on the horse. Very colonial, if you ask me. I also saw that both Australia and South Africa have a Taurus stellium, and I mean, yeah. So cooked. So with the linear way of looking at time, it focuses on progression and deadlines and future planning, every moment considered distinct in some way, and you choose the chapters of any given moment. You choose when the moment starts and stops based on your interaction with this moment, right? I've come to this beach. I'm going to be at this beach for an hour and a half, how long it takes me to do this podcast, and then I'll leave the beach. This is how I'm thinking about time and my interaction with this space. What I intend to do here and how long I intend to do it sets the benchmark for how I view the time. However, in Aboriginal time, it's cyclical and interconnected. So time is seen as a recurring flow where past, present, and future coexist, everything, everywhere, all at once. So events are connected to the land, to spiritual realms and ancestral knowledge. So when people in Australia said, but we said sorry, all right, the stolen generation, that was this long ago. Colonization, that was our ancestors. We didn't do that. Well, Western thinking of time will allow you to uncouple yourself from any experiences that happened before or after you, especially when you perceive yourself to have no direct influence. If everything's happening all the time, everywhere, all at once, then that means that colonization wasn't a process of just, less than maybe 280 years of devastation. It's an ongoing thing because the essence of what happened has not left the land just because the violence that we can see has temporarily waned. What this land has experienced is an indication of what this land has experienced. So if you're living in a culture where people believe that if I wasn't there, I wasn't holding the weapon, I didn't see the crime, I didn't watch that go down, I don't know anyone who experienced that, then it's not real. And you can imagine how many things just kind of get lost in the semantics of the fact that, well, if I didn't do it, it's not my fault. As opposed to a First Nations way of thinking that the land experienced it, we experienced it. The experience we have on the land shows us how we experience it and will continue to experience it. And if you understood anything about spiritual warfare, you'd be like, oh, this is why a place this beautiful, this serene, and this calm could be home to so much violence. You would understand duality, and you'd also understand that you can't escape what is. There is no rewriting history. We're living out history every time. Everything you see around you is indication of how things have and will continue to play out. And so another way you can compare Western time to First Nations Aboriginal time is that Western time governs events. So schedules and punctuality are very highly valued and regarded, and events are planned to fit into strict timelines. So if I say we're meeting at 9, we meet at 9. And if you come at 9:15, well, that's rude. You're not appreciating my time. And so it's almost like regardless of external circumstances, regardless of all the other factors that would feed into whether or not you're able to get your preferred place at 9, 10, 11, you are now held to this standard that you have to control all these entities around you to do this, as opposed to Aboriginal time where the events you're doing dictate time. And it also reminds me of how my mum would talk to me about her childhood. She was raised a farmer. Her parents were also farmers. And you do stuff based on what you have to do in a day. So if she is helping her dad manage the cocoa, or she's helping her mum sell plantain, then that is what needs to be done. And the day revolves around that. And so, yes, you might have plans to hang out with your friends and go to dinner, but it will happen after you're done with your event. So when events dictate time, people gather and they act and they convene when it feels right. I'm not going to say there's no, but this kind of like obligatory corporal approach to engaging with people dissipates and is replaced by events and dinners and ceremonies and gatherings where they start when everybody is ready, or when the environment, whether it's the weather or the way an animal is behaving, all of that dictates the appropriate moment for something to happen. I tell this story quite a bit when I'm trying to explain to people how Ghana is different from Australia. So I can't count to you how many Ubers I've been in where I've asked, how long is it going to take to go from here to here? And they'll say, God willing, we'll get there. What's that telling you? Like, the driver can't decide for us when we're going to get somewhere. Yes, there is a calculation or a formula that we could put together and estimate. But when your driver says to you, God willing, we're going to get there, it's like actually reminding you of the environment that you're in. What he's saying is, I don't control this shit, babe. I'm just driving the car, okay? So let me just drive the car, and when we get there, you'll know how long it took. And so when you think about the relationship to land and nature through time, in Western culture, time is treated as like a universal construct regardless of the location. And that's why you can see a lot of comments on the internet, people being like, how is it dark where you are? It's lunchtime where I am. And it's like, of course you think that the way that you're experiencing time is the way to experience time, as opposed to a reflection of the environment that you're living in that's experiencing time differently. Experiencing time differently should be the indicator that time is not a linear construct, because currently we all experience it differently. And this is why we have all this confusion with time zones, daylight savings, this and that, because it directly contradicts the idea that time is linear. The amount of friends I'll speak to in Mexico who are like, oh my God, you're in the future. It's like, yeah, based on Western context, I am in the future, but doesn't it make so much sense that we're just experiencing life at the same time, regardless, and trying to create micro moments that keep us feeling stifled? So in the Aboriginal context, time is tied to land, seasons, and cycles of nature. So that means, yes, it's still specific to the place and the culture. So yes, instead of feeling that time is a linear thing and everybody needs to get on the time spectrum at the same time to arrive at the same destination, the way that Aboriginal people are doing it, and you have to remember that before colonization, there were 250 nations living on this land with different cultures, different languages, different norms, different expectations, different stories. And so the way they use time is tying it to the cycles of nature, land, and seasons, right? So looking at the way a certain plant is flowering is going to give you indication of the time it is, as opposed to creating an event to give you an indication as to what the time is. Like, me looking at where the sun is a better indication of what time it is than me telling Alice I'm going to call her back at 6, because really, what is 6 o'clock? If anything, I should say, I'm going to call you when I'm finished. And then when I'm finished, you know that I'm done. And so again, in the Western context, you'll see how when we refer to history with that linear progression, it gives you the impression that as time is moving, change is obviously happening positively, as opposed to recognizing stories and songs and experiences all interweave time. They show you all the different ways in which time is playing out, which is profound in itself. So then what happens in First Nations culture, Indigenous cultures, but specifically Aboriginal culture, is that memory is now layered with this like non-linear wisdom, right? That comes from your ancestors or your stories. And then you're fusing that with your contemporary understanding of your experience. And so it contrasts the kind of like modern children of immigrant, whatever wound of being like, oh my God, I've missed out, you know, like I wasn't raised in that culture, therefore I can't go back and experience what I wasn't able to experience then, so now I'm opted out of that experience. Or, you know, I've lived in this place for this long and I haven't gone to my home country in this long, and with each year that passes, I become less of my culture. It's just such an insane way to put it. And also, it aligns itself really perfectly with this colonial narrative that is pushing you towards assimilation at all times. It's giving you the framework and the guidebook to suppress parts of yourself that you're not able to access because this country and other countries like it have created systems where you don't have access to your time, money, or energy. And so the longer you stay in these cultures, the easier it is for you to kind of like forward roll into a simulation before you've even realized you've done it. It's kind of like an avalanche. As it gets further and further down the hill, it gains momentum. So I hear a lot of people talk about a lot of countries, like whether it's in like South America, Africa, Central America, or even Asia, talk about how they don't understand how these places could also be henchmen for Western imperialism. I'm like, this tells me you haven't been listening. You haven't been paying attention. The way these systems work is so spiritual because a lot of us are being taught to look at what we can see and what we've experienced as indication of what is real. And a lot of these systems function in the space between, where you don't even see the systems because they're invisible. That is spiritual. And this is exactly why conversations around patriarchy and feminism and racism and bigotry and sexism and femicide and matricide in Australia especially, it's like so difficult for so many people to understand because they're kind of like, wait, but like, look at this guy. Like, he looked like he had a good job and he's attractive. How could he do that? And it's like, yeah, this is how you've been trained to see shit. Like, you're looking at what you can verify with your eyes as opposed to trusting yourself, your instincts, your intuition, and also the experiences of others that you can't validate or vouch for, but use this information, combine it. It's like a lot of Indigenous cultures, First Nation cultures teach you how to take not only your contemporary lived experience, but the wisdom from your ancestors, past and present and future, to make decisions. And this is why you'll see in this country and so many others like it, people will knowingly go against their best interests because they don't know how to use the part of their mind, body, and spirit that'll show them that trusting themselves is the right thing to do. Say it with me, spiritual warfare. The last thing I want to talk about is like the purpose and the perception of time, because in Western culture, time is a resource. I talk about it a lot in astrology as well, where time, money, energy are resources, things that you have access to that you can use to will in other things towards you. It's your payment, it's your transaction, but it's also in the same way, how you value it also dictates how much value you're able to gain from it. So a Western view is that time is money. You've got to spend it wisely. Do you care more about your time or your money, as though they're not interconnected, interrelated concepts? It's like the type of place where people are kind of like, oh, you know, it's a weekend, so I'm not going to waste the weekend by taking a trip to Japan because that's not worth it. As opposed to thinking, okay, well, the way that your life is set up, you get access to 3 consecutive weeks of your own time once a year. So this means at your rate, you can only do one thing you really want to do once a year, and you're going to live 80 to 100 years. That actually doesn't work for me. I'm getting reflux thinking about it. 5:55 on the clock. But in Aboriginal time is relational and it's spiritual. Also, I'm gathering, right? So my friend Will was explaining, he watched a few more videos like this, and he was saying that they spend 4 hours doing what we would describe as work, doing emails, whatever it is, and then the rest of the time they are awake, they're in ceremony. And when you describe ceremony in a Western lens, we view ceremony as every now and then. Ceremony is kind of like Christmas, Easter, Halloween. It's this event that happens once, and then you go, and then you do it, and then you wait for the next year to do it again. People waiting for this permission to share and be with community and to celebrate life. But ceremony in a lot of other contexts is about the ongoing daily work that you need to do to remember who you are, where you come from, and what your duty is. What is your dharma? What is your purpose? And so then suddenly your priority every day is sustaining your relationship with your ancestors. So I think about, like I said before, my mum being raised a farmer, the thing that was most important every day is to do the farm work, because the farm work, you're tilling the land, you're also guaranteeing that you're going to have something to eat, an income with something to sell. But also what you learn by working within elements that you can't control. Oh, what happened to the crops? We've got to troubleshoot. You need to do this and this and this. Like, it's real life every day. I've seen an uptick of people creating videos talking about the fake jobs that they have, the jobs that they are being forced to do and to put on a pedestal like they're saving lives, when in reality they work in marketing. And like, yes, sure, marketing's a real job. We have to know where we can buy the things we need to survive, whatever. But do we all need to be marketers is the question. No Deep Dives, a Flex Mommy podcast. So I'm done finishing this podcast. So I'm going to call Alice, and then I'm going to have a QHHT hypnosis session. And before I forget, rate the show 5 stars and 5 stars only, and tell a friend to tell a friend. Stop gatekeeping me. Thank you. Miss you. Bye.